Hello everyone, welcome to the first seminar series of our XAMI initiative, which will intersect this month the IS Research Seminar Series for 2022. Today I have the honor to have here engineer Tomás Alves from Instituto Superior Técnico, University of Lisbon in Portugal. So Tomás has received a master's degree in Information Systems and Computer Engineering from the University of Lisbon, Instituto Superior Técnico, in 2017, and is currently working towards a PhD degree in the same university. He is also the co-coordinator of the Human Laboratory at INESC-ID, where his research focuses on developing personality-aware information visualization systems. He is also interested in game-based task difficulty adjustments and techniques. And again, Tomás, the reason I invited you here is because we've been interacting a lot with some students in Lisbon. I've been honored to be part of the master's jury panel. And I confess that I have been always very impressed by Tomás' work capacity and his capacity also to lead the students to such a fantastic research work. And for that reason, I wanted to know more about Tomás' research. So it is a honor today to have here Tomás to talk about us investigating trust in visualization through the lens of personality psychology. So thank you, Tomás. I pass the stage to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Now, I'm going to talk a bit, as Katrina said, about how to investigate trust in visualization, and we're going to do that through the lens of personality psychology. And first, I want to thank my supervisors, Professors Sandra Gama, Daniel Gonçalves, and Joana Henrique Escalado, as well as my former master student, Carlota Dias, for their work. And I'm going to present two studies that we conducted all together. So for starters, to position myself, visualization is now everywhere, okay? And in particular, we have seen the rise of decision support systems that leverage visualization. However, we also know that decision tasks are vulnerable to many factors, such as cognitive biases, uncertainty, and trust. Now, in particular, the level of trust has been proven to affect decision-making through visualization. Now, in human-based trust relationships, there are two elements. We have the truster, the one who trusts, and the trustee, the one who is trusted. However, in visualization, the terms that we apply are the trust perception in relation to the information that we are seeing and the trustworthiness of the visualization. Regarding visualization, trust assesses the tendency to rely on it, and it helps users to build knowledge. We have also found that risk factors in the information that is being displayed exacerbate the role of trust. And trust is good because, in particular, it helps minimize data uncertainty. Now, regarding trust perception, it tackles the quality and reliability of the visualization, the way we assess it. And it can be influenced by the misalignment of graphical elements or prior experiences, user intentions, perceived risk, for instance. Now, regarding visualization trustworthiness, on the other hand, it assesses features of the channels and visual encodings. Those include whether the visualization is accurate, objective, complete, and a recent study by Xiang et al. Found that participants were more likely to choose visualizations that appear to be clear, more thorough, and disclose a higher amount of information. And by choosing, I mean trust the most and use on their experiment. Other factors that may affect are, for instance, the usability or user experience that users have while using a visualization. However, there is, to the best of our knowledge, there are too few studies leveraging the role of trust in visualization. In addition to it, research usually assumes that the user profile of the decision maker follows a one-size-fits-all strategy. However, research in individual differences has already shown that not two users are equal to one another. And we also believe that it is worth to enrich the decision maker user profile to provide a further understanding of the role of trust in visualization. Now, there are several individual differences that you can leverage, for instance, visualization literacy, cognitive traits, or personality. And here we focus on personality, which is defined as a set of habitual behaviors, cognitions, and emotional patterns that influence the construction of a mental model. It's a stable construct throughout one's life, and that's shown to have an impact on technology acceptance, technology use, and more importantly, it determines how we perceive trust. So we decided to tackle these personality factors and complement the profile of the decision maker and introduce these concepts by also, in this case, studying the trust building process with visualization. Now, to state our research question is the following: can personality psychology help understand the trust building process with visualization? So for our first study, where we decided how we should tackle it, first, of course, there are too many data features to study, so we have to focus on something. And in this case, we opted for the time dimension, as it's shown a strong role in past visualization research. We could tackle several features, such as linear time versus cyclic time, time points versus time intervals, or order time versus branching time. In our case, we opted to tackle a feature that we define as temporal framing, and it is the temporal scope that is presented in the domain of visualization, such as daily, weekly, or monthly. And we base our decision in the work of Oscar et al., since they showed that how important it is to consider the granularity of the information in the visualization. We also decided to include some risk to promote trust. And in this case, we are going to tackle a health emergency scenario focused on an overcrowding crisis, which means that there is no space left to meet the timely needs of the following patients requiring emergency care. Now, to visualize information, we, in this case, opted for line charts since they are familiar to the usual user and are enough to study our research question. And we designed 3 visualizations. The first is per hour, so this is the daily visualization. And the weekly visualization shows per weekday, and the monthly shows per day. So in this case, you can see 2 lines. Each line represents an hospital and the number of patients that are in the hospital at that given point in time. Now, regarding the decision-making activities of the study, we divide them in 3 parts. The first part, users see all charts simultaneously, and we ask them which visualization do you trust the most and which hospital would you prefer to visit. In this case, we are asking users to have an anchor temporal frame, which means that we want to study in which temporal frame they will trust the most, and we want to study that initial positioning will affect the rest of the experience. So after they watch all charts simultaneously, they will visualize the charts individually in a random order. And while interacting with each chart, we're going to ask them 3 tasks so that they acknowledge the information and interact with the chart. And the tasks are: what is the number of patients on a specific point in time, which hospital had the greatest growth of patients in a specific time interval, and which hospital would you prefer to visit. And finally, we repeat the first step. And it's basically the same. They visualized all the charts simultaneously, and we ask them again, which visualization do they trust the most, and which hospital would they prefer to visit. Now, we do this to test whether the self-calibrated degree of confidence holds. Okay, so the reason why we ask people to evaluate the visualizations simultaneously twice is that we want to test their self-calibrated degree of confidence in their decisions and correspondingly to how they assess the visualization they trust the most. And notice that first they watch simultaneously, and then they watch individually, and then afterwards again simultaneously. So what we want to check is if they interact with the visualizations individually, does that change the anchor frame that they trust the most at the beginning? Now, as I mentioned, we are covering 3 specific tests. So find the number of patients for a specific point in time, which hospital had the greatest growth of patients, and choose one hospital to visit in the case of an emergency. Now, we ran this experiment with 88 participants, 37 male, 51 female, around 27 years old. And we measured user interaction to understand how they what was their behavior while assessing the visualizations and choosing whether to trust them or not. And for the user interaction, we collect the over events per data point and task completion time. Then we ask them, how much do you trust this visualization with a 5-point Likert scale? And regarding demographics, we collect gender, age, visual acuity, familiarity with line charts, and when was the last time they visited an hospital in an emergency, and finally the personality factors. Now, I've not mentioned which personality factors we're covering, so I'm going to tackle that now. And we first decided to use the 5-factor model, which is otherwise known as a Big Five. And as you know, it divides personality in 5 main traits: the neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Now, research has already shown that personality facets, which are subdivisions of each trait, provide further understanding of what's happening regarding the personality psychology scope. So, as I mentioned, each trait divides into 6 facets. Now, there are a lot, as you can see. So for this instance, we decided to focus on anxiety, vulnerability, and trust. Trust, because we're measuring trust, so we want to see whether the effects that we find in social relationships still hold in the visualization case. And then since we're putting people on a risky situation with a pressure, the health emergency case, we want to check whether the anxiety, which is the tendency to be anxious, and the vulnerability, which is the tendency to be vulnerable to external factors, whether they are affected by the context of the experience and whether they project their effects on the user interaction and decisions with the visualization. Now, so one of the expected findings that we had was that, well, the trust facet positively affects trust perception. Now, when we run our statistical analysis, we saw that there was no effect. And by the way, we divided people. This here is people with high trust, average levels of trust, and low levels of trust. Now, as we can see here, they were basically the same. Okay, so the trust facet, the tendency to trust in someone, in this case, did not transfer its effect to the visualizations. People assess them with similar scores across all visualizations. Now, we also expected that anxiety will negatively affect trust perception. So more anxious people will not trust more on a visualization. On the contrary, they will be more distrustful. What we found was that people with high anxiety were, in this case, more prone to trust. As you can see here, there's a large difference between the groups. So people who are more anxious, they provide higher scores of trust. And that does not happen with the other groups, since they follow the same tendency. Now, another expected finding that we had was that the anxiety facet positively affects the number of overs per point and the time to choose an hospital. So people who are more anxious, they'll take more time to decide because they will be more anxious, and they will interact more with the visualization. Now, interestingly, what we found here, and I'm going to hint for an effect that we discussed afterwards, was that in the weekly visualization, as you can see here, people that are more anxious interacted a lot more than with the other groups, and then they were followed by people with low anxiety and then average anxiety. In the daily and the monthly, they were basically the same. So what we believe was that the number of data points had a major effect here. And I'm going to discuss that afterwards, because in the day, it's 24 data points, so 24 hours of the day. The monthly has 31 points, but the weekly only has 7. So what we believe that happened here was that people, anxious people, interacted more when there were less data points. And regarding the time to choose an hospital, we can see that they were faster, slightly faster in the weekly and as well as on the monthly. In the day, the groups were basically the same. So as we can see here, the anxiety facet shows that people who have a high score on this facet are more likely to deviate their behavior from the other groups. We also studied the vulnerability, as I mentioned, and we wanted to check whether it affects user interaction, but we did not find not a good, but a significant effect here. We see that, for instance, people who are less vulnerable or have less of a tendency to be vulnerable to external factors, they are usually performing less overs, but they, along with people with high vulnerability, take less time to choose which hospital they want to go to. And here you can see that actually people with an average are the ones that are differentiating from the others. So this is a particularly interesting effect that we want to study more in future studies, to check why extremes in the vulnerability facet make people be faster choosing in a medical emergency. Now, next we want to check whether anxiety made individuals change their anchor framing from the first decision phase to the third decision phase. And here we checked that it was not the case. So the variation was very similar across groups, which shows that anxiety did not have an effect on how people change their choice between the anchor frame moments. So the general takeaways that we saw here are that anxious individuals assess visualizations with higher trust scores, and anxiety also affects the over events that people make while interacting with the visualizations, and that vulnerable people take more time to decide between the hospital that they want to go when there's a health emergency case scenario. Now, we also found that the propensity to trust, so the trust facet, did not have an effect. So we imagine that it does not transfer its effect to visualization. And as I mentioned before, we believe that what played a major role here was that there were a different amount of data points across all visualizations. So the temporal framing effect was not independent of how many data points there were. In these slides, we decided to design a second study. And in this case, we want to assess through specified dimensions and a fixed amount of data points across visualizations whether the visualization trustworthiness can vary across individuals based on personality profiles. Now, in this case, we focus on hierarchical visualizations, and I'm going to cover it a bit later, but instead of asking users how much you trust this visualization, we in this time tackle 3 dimensions of visualization trustworthiness. So we are very specific here. And the main reason is that there are no validated apparatus to measure trust as of now in visualization. So we kind of had to explore a bit. Now, regarding hierarchy visualizations, there are many to choose from, each varying in channels and encodings, but we have to make it so that each visualization that we want to tackle can represent the same data set without so much of a overwhelming addition of removing of channels and encodings. So these are the visualizations that people assess. We have a Sankey diagram, a tree map, and a sunburst. And as you can see, they each have the same amount of data points, and they are able to visualize information through length for the Sankey, through an arc angle for the sunburst, and through an area for the tree map. And then we asked people, while they interact with each of these visualizations, 5 questions. So the first was which category has more subcategories. The second was which city, it's the middle level of the hierarchy, as in this case, middle level, with the largest number of lower level instances. So this is the prototype of the questions that we asked. And then we fixed the lower level and asked for the domain units of a middle level instance so that they could find the element with the majority of that unit. Then how many, in this case, how many units are there in the upper level? And then how many of the units are there in the lower level from a fixed middle level instance? So in this case, we tackle 5 different types of tasks, each trying to make people either finding the number of categories, summing, fixing levels and then ask for a specific value, etc. So that people actually have to process and do some critical analytical tasks. This time we ran it with 51 participants, 25 male, 26 female, around 28 years old. And again, we measured user interaction through the number of over events and task completion time. As I mentioned, trust assessment was made with a 5-point Likert scale. In this case, we tackled clarity, which is a perceived level of comprehensibility of information, coverage, the perceived completeness, and look and feel, the overall visual appearance. Regarding demographics, we tackle again gender, age, visual acuity, familiarity with charts, and personality factors. Now, as I mentioned, there are a lot of personality facets, but in this case, we want to keep the trust, check whether in fact it does not transfer its effect to visualization. And given that we are using visual encodings for hierarchy data that vary their perceptual channels, we want to check whether the tendency of one person to be organized and to follow goal-oriented purposes or strategies, in this case, which is related to conscientiousness, and in this case, one's tendency to be competent and one's tendency to deliberate, whether they affect, in this case, how people assess the trust of charts. So first, we believe that the facet scores, and as I mentioned, it's the tendency for one to follow goal-oriented strategies. So we imagine that if the scores are higher, they will be faster responding because they follow optimal strategies. Now, in this case, we did not find any effect regarding that specific point. As you can see here, average people with an average competence score tend to be faster in the sunburst, but in the other charts, they're pretty much the same. Then deliberation, we see a tendency that people who have a high deliberation and an average score, they usually are faster than people that do not deliberate that much. So this is an interesting finding that we want to explore further, because we would imagine that people that have a tendency to deliberate more will take more time to respond. But in this time, we found the contrary effect. And again, we believe that the people who are more competent and people who deliberate more, they are actually more accurate completing the tasks. Now, we did not find, again, any specific main effects from the competence. As you can see, they keep very similar accuracy across all charts. But in the Sankey, they can distinguish themselves from the other groups, as you can see here. Then regarding deliberation, we can see a clear main effect, and people who deliberate more have a tendency to always be on top, independently of the chart. Okay. Then we want to check the trust assessment, and here it's more of a U-shaped effect. So people who are less competent and less deliberate, we believe that they do not care so much as regarding the layout of the hierarchical data. So they assess with medium-low scores of visualization trustworthiness. But we imagine that people with high conscientiousness will be more distrustful. And this is based on actual work that has already been done in the literature. And they will attribute with lower scores the visualization trustworthiness. So we expect that people in the average scores will rate with higher scores of visualization trustworthiness compared to people that are on the upper or lower percentiles. Now, in this case, we can actually see an effect that is more present when we look at sunburst and tree map, where people who have an average score tend to rate the clarity with pretty much higher scores compared to the other groups. And coverage, we see exactly the same trend. but that does not happen in look and feel. And this kind of makes sense because the look and feel is more associated to how we feel, so more of an openness to experience trait effect than conscientiousness, because conscientiousness is more related to how organized I am, how I like to compartmentalize, and etc. Now, this is for competence. If we look at deliberation, we can actually see again this kind of effect. So people with an average deliberation are usually rating with higher clarity and usually rating with higher coverage as well. They're only topped by people with low deliberation on the sunburst here, but there is a tendency here. Then regarding look and feel, we see the exact same result, only that people that do not have a tendency to deliberate, they really dislike the tree map. So this is again future work that we need to tackle. Finally, again, we want to check whether the trust scores, and in this case, trust is the trust facet from agreeableness, whether it influences the perceived visualization trustworthiness. And similar to the first study, we did not see an effect. So they are pretty much the same in the sunburst. You can see some deviations in the Sankey and the tree map regarding clarity. Regarding coverage, it's basically the same trend. And regarding the look and feel, again, we cannot find a differentiating factor based on the trust scores of the individuals. So our first main finding is that the layout affects the perceived trustworthiness. But we also found that faces from conscientiousness have a relevant role in this assessment, in particular regarding perceived clarity and perceived coverage of the chart. Moreover, we found that user accuracy can be predicted based on the deliberation facets. And the most interesting thing about these two findings was that there is no current work in state-of-the-art research in visualization that shows a measurable effect of conscientiousness under the study conditions. So this is the first time that conscientiousness, and in this case faces from conscientiousness, showed an effect leveraging visualization. Again, we did not find that trust plays a role in visualization. So we do not believe that the current personality model, which is more oriented towards social relations, is that it can be applied to visualization, because people usually regard visualization as an apparatus, as an artifact, and not another sentient unity that we can interact with and trust with. So future studies and limitations, we would like to test this with a larger sample size, because it's no personality. We need a lot of people to corroborate our findings, and want to keep the sample size balanced across all groups. And when I say groups, I mean people with high, average, and low scores. And we want to explore more tasks and more layouts, because we have already found that the actual layout shows that people trust or assess the trustworthiness of that layout with higher or lowest scores. Finally, we corroborated work by Xiong et al., showing that more data points equals more trustworthiness, which was not the main finding that we expected to expect in the first study, but we believe that it clearly drove our results, and that designers should promote trustworthiness through the visual layout. Sorry, PowerPoint kind of crashed. So as I was saying, research should promote the visualization trustworthiness through the chosen visual layout, and that personality synergies are important and play a role in trust building process. So they should be accounted for when we are designing visualizations, and in this case, visualization-based decision support systems. And that designers should aim at enriching the user profile with this type of characteristics. And that's it. So again, special thanks to Sandra Gama, Daniela Gonçalves, Joana Fitzgerald, and Carla Dias. Thank you for your attention, invitation, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Tomás. So I open now the audience to ask some questions. You can either write in the chat or speak directly to Tomás. I can start. So Tomás, I was very intrigued by a statement that you said in the beginning of your talk, which said there needs to be some risk to promote trust. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, there is already some work, not necessarily in visualization, that shows that when there's risk involved in the decision tasks, people are more likely to trust. So it exacerbates the need to trust, and it will usually prompt a trust in that case. The main thing is that, sorry.
Yeah, continue, sorry.
I was saying that the main limitation on the first study is that there is no actual risk, because no one needs to go to the hospital, right, when they're conducting the experiment. So although we tried to make an artificial risk, in that case we were not able to, well, instill the riskiness. But we've seen that, and people corroborate that through the thinking aloud, that they were actually actively judging the visualizations and weighing whether they should follow a specific temporal frame or not.
This is interesting, Tomás, because again, here at XAMI, we deal with black boxes that are for high stakes decision making, right? So these are black boxes that can make decisions about either you have to go to an operation or not, for instance. And it's very interesting what you just said, because that means that, again, we need to somehow be able to design these explanations that are targeted at the user, and maybe putting that awareness of risk at the visualization, or at least the explanation component, then seems to be a vital component according to the literature that you're surveying.
Yeah, I could give you the references afterwards.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that would be great. And I have another question on my side. Can you, I didn't get, how can you measure the personality of your users? How can you know the levels of trust, anxiety, competence, and deliberation of your users?
We use the NeoPyR, which is a standard questionnaire for personality assessment. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to cramp up the presentation too much with the details.
So pretty much when you selected your user groups, you gave them a questionnaire to assess what kind of personality you had. So probably you had a bigger sample, and then you constrained the sample to only the people who had those characteristics, correct?
Everyone can participate in our study, and including in the procedure, they have to fill in the NeoPyR questionnaire, and then we conduct the study, and only afterwards we calculate the scores and study whether there was an effect or not. That's why we actually need to balance the groups across the personality scores that we define. Because the main problem is that since we are tackling the people with high, average, or low values, so we categorize high as the 75 percentile or higher, low 25 percentile or lower. So it's kind of hard to select a lot of people for a specific group beforehand. Because the distribution, and we base this distribution in the Portuguese population, it's already been done a few years ago, the high, average, low. And as of now, it's not that easy to get someone, make them perform the NeoPyR, which usually takes 40 minutes, and then, oh, sorry, that group is filled in.
Okay, thank you. There's here a question from Miguel. So did the participants know the hospitals and cities of the visualizations? If so, how you managed the data familiarity of the participants during the experiments?
Okay, thank you for your questions, Katerina, and Miguel as well. The hospitals were hospital pink and hospital red, or something about it. We chose names so that they didn't have any connotation with anything real. They were not pink or red because there is a bias of preference. There were other names, but what I mean is they do not mean anything for the general user. So the familiarity of the hospitals was in this case, we believe it did not produce any measurable effect. The hospitals were also, for each experiment and for each visualization, the order of the hospitals. So the trend was randomly selected as well. We just wanted to check whether the temporal frame made an effect. So the rest was pretty much randomized to reduce any potential biases. Thank you.
Any more questions for Tomás?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, Tomás. Thank you very much. It's again.
Ah, you pronounced it very good. Well done,
Yeah.
Chun. You pronounced his name very well.
Oh, okay. I follow what you pronounce. So I grabbed the opportunity just to pronounce the name after you finish. Yeah. So it's very interesting. And again, I think we learned, the presentation with the pictures and it's very lively and quite colorful. So again, yeah, because usually our slides are usually packed with text and some graphs, but I think this is absolutely a nice, perspective that we can learn. So I have a couple of questions, Tomás. One is that I guess at the end, what you have is that because what I can see through your presentation that you picked every, I think you have these factors, right? And all perspectives, and you picked for example, the anxiety, vulnerability from the first group, and then you start to look at the liberation, something from the other group. And then for each of them, you work out whether they have correlation or affect the different, I think, different way of the visualization. So are you looking at your end, let's say, product or outcome is that you have your user come in, and because as you said, you will give them a questionnaire. This is back to Katerina's question, that how do you measure their level of anxiety, and how do you know they have a high, medium, and low? So, but you do have your way of measuring that. And so can I understand that, or is my understanding right, that then the very end, the kind of like end product or output for you is that you have a person coming, and then then you can measure this different perspectives, and then you kind of have like user personal profile. Yep. And then you use that user personal profile because you look at different, factors, and then you can recommend a visualization design. Is that what you look for at the end?
Yeah, that's the end product. So to explain you the full procedure, it's basically the NeoPy-R questionnaire. It's 240 questions, I believe, and they're separated 80 for each trait. So when you fill each question and they're positively and negatively scored, so you have a formula, and then you finally have a score for each trait and each facet. Now, a few years ago, when NeoPy-R was validated for the Portuguese population, they did a national survey where they collected the scores for everyone. And then they created a distribution table based on the percentiles. So if you have a score of 95, you are on the percentile X, right?
You are on the percentile X, or this person, for example, I came in and I have this personality, the score. I have a score and telling me whether on the anxiety, vulnerability, deliberation, and this like a, my profile. Like you have the score. And then I think what you've done is that you said, okay, through each of your score, through each of the factors, and I work out what would be a better, design of the facet in my visualization. So based on this, I take your profile, of course, through this, questionnaire measurement, and then I work through your findings, and then I can make a recommendation for a good visualization design for me.
Yep, that's our end product, because then you can enrich the user profile with those type of scores, and note that those scores, and we use that, depend on the gender and the age of the participant.
Okay, so gender and age, they're also part of your profile in addition to personnel.
When they made the distribution, it actually depends on whether there are young adults or adults and female or male. So we have that into account when we define in which percentile you should be. And then based on that percentile, we categorize you with high, medium, or low. But we always have the scores. But in this case, to ease the processing, we categorize people in high, average, or low in anxiety, vulnerability, etc. And what we expect from this is when you enrich user profile, and we imagine this in the future, you are carrying a token or whatever, and it has your personal information. So when a system reads your token and knows your information, if it knows that you're more anxious, it might either give a little tip with help, or it might highlight some specific points that you should consider.
Okay.
And the major objective is in the future, when this kind of information is ubiquitous, so people are traveling with them and they're read by every machine. The machine itself can adapt its content and the way it displays information for the user. Because as we've seen, people with high or low competence scores attribute different trustworthiness scores to some hierarchical visualizations, and they're displaying the same data. So if we want, let's say, COVID pandemic, again, topic, you are showing daily the distribution of COVID infections in your country. So districts, counties, etc. And people will perceive them or trust differently on the way that you're showing that visualization. So we want, in this case, to instill, you can trust in this visualization, this data is accurate. So please don't go out if we are in the middle of pandemic and people need to stay at home. So kind of to leverage those dynamics that happen when information is used to promote, in this case, the welfare.
I see.
Of course, you have the other side of the coin, that you're giving data that it's bad for people if they learn from it, and you can manipulate people to trust more on that bad data. But we're just giving the tools now. It's just the ethics we cannot.
I see.
We cannot do that.
I didn't ask that question. Yeah, but I see your point.
There's a very good book called How to Lie with Statistics that speaks exactly about that, how you can make your visualizations to manipulate the public to believe something that is not actually what the data is telling. Yeah,
that's something that we love in our course. And I love to see that on Reddit, because it's just, that's why, I don't know if you noticed, but each chart that I made started 0, because the variables actually start at 0. If you do not start at 0, the visual differences that you can see between the points are exacerbated and do not show the real difference.
I think also the granularity of the unit of data that you can show that will make a difference as well. You are right. Yes, yes. That's okay. That's quite interesting. I think my next question is probably want to get some of your thoughts, because as Katrina mentioned that in XAMI group, I think for us the users are not quite about individuals, and their personality. I think at this stage, what we're more looking at is our front, because for explainable AI generating explanations, of course, we have the user end. Who are the end users? Who is the audience or the cohort of users that we're going to generate the explanation for? That's of course a key aspect, and to make the explanation understandable, acceptable, or even persuasive, of course, there need to be, again, also the design on what kind of way of presenting the explanation, and then of course visualization, the way presenting explanation in visualization, of course, is also very. I think that's one of the key way, the key approach that we can use. So for us, I guess at this stage, what we'll be looking at probably less about the personal, this personal traits or factors. It's more about people's profession and I guess their background, like their career, their background, their education, their area, the domain of expertise. So I'm thinking that probably what we can learn from your project is that how we can actually make a profile based on those aspects of users, and then sort of like also inspired by your research here is where, of course, we measure the different profile, and then also from that profile to come up with what visualization will be more, maybe not more trustworthy, but more understandable. So for us, it's more understandable. more acceptable, and then, you know, more persuasive. And
more
yeah,
targeted
so
to the user. Yeah.
yeah,
So it has
yeah,
to be more targeted for the user, because if you generate an explanation for a doctor, that's different from generating the same explanation for a patient, right? It's different backgrounds, like Chun was saying.
Yeah, and the purpose is also different, I think. And the interesting of the focus and interesting information that they want to get from this explanation is also different. But Tomás, I think your presentation and then your research, yes, really will help us to learn a lot. Yeah, and I think in your case, I think measuring the personal factor and traits, that's actually a lot more difficult if we talk about measuring, you know, coming up with a profile based on the profession, education background, capability, or domain. Yes, I think in your case, the personal profile aspect of measuring is actually, I think that's more challenging.
Yeah, we're basically doing the same. The end product is the same, just making visualization more human.
Yeah, more suitable, more understandable, but catering for the user. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments and questions.
Adam has a question. At least he's raising his hand.
Yep. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. So just going on with continue on from John's question there. So the outcome is that each person has a very sort of specialized visualization for when they look at that, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's the end goal. So you have the decision support system, which showcases some type of visualization. And when you are interacting with it, the visualization adapts channels, encodings, etc., so that it's more trustworthy for you, and it actually enhances your performance, your decisions. It diminishes your susceptibility to some cognitive bias, for instance. That's the end goal.
So let's say that is the case, and it's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
In this what-if situation, if you had two people that were polar opposites, so they saw very different visualizations of the same data, what do you think would happen if they met and both viewed the same data?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Yeah. So what if these two polar opposite people with very different visualizations met, viewed the same data side by side, but neither had actually ever seen the other visualization because of this personalization?
Let me think. So, I mean, if the visualization is adapting to themselves, it's basically because they share some characteristics with the users through which the visualizations were developed. So you should share a common set of references or performance issues, etc., with some channels and encodings. So I would imagine that the one that it's tailored for you will be better. But if we're talking about, for instance, personality, there are a lot of synergies that may have an effect and deviate you from the normal group. We have actually seen that as well in another study.
Okay. So do you think that will also affect the sort of trustworthiness in this case?
When you're designing your guidelines for this particular group for this particular group of people, these type of channels or encodings promote trustworthiness. If you're using that as a basis and you actually develop visualizations to two people which are the opposite and have never seen those visualizations, I would imagine that based on the individual difference that you use, if it's clear cut, like visualization literacy, or if it's with a lot of dynamics such as personality, it may have a different degree of acceptance, of trustworthiness, of performance on that specific person. What I mean is there's a lot of uncharted territory right now, and we still have to explore it. But I would imagine that if they were designed based on a group that shares common characteristics with the people that are seeing them now, they will be better suited, because that's the basis that you use. That's your heuristic when you're devising this kind of research, right? You expect that people who have never seen the apparatus, that they will be better with that apparatus than with any other.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
I may have not communicated it well, but what I meant was that they've only ever seen that one specialized visualization. And so it's not them accepting it, it's them then seeing the other end. So they've always seen this one specialized visualization from your outcomes of your work, right? It's tailored to their particular preference and their acceptance, and they've accepted it. But in this scenario, or the one I'm trying to describe, is they're now viewing someone else's specialized visualization.
Okay, sorry, I get it now. I think that, let's see, I think that they'll be more resistant to working with that visualization, and they will score it poorly, because Dagpusta et al., I can give you that reference et al., show that familiarity plays a major role. So if people are used to work with a specific set of channels and encodings, when they're met with, let's say, the opposites, they will not like it as much or interact with it as much.
Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to play out that what if to see what would happen. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Anyone would like to ask any additional question to Tomás? Otherwise, I still have a last question. Tomás, just one, again, this might be a silly question. If we go to the domain of social science, psychology, I'm sure there are lots of theories about trust and trustworthiness. Is your work grounded in any major psychological theory on trust or in social sciences? How do you come up with measuring a trust when there's so many theories or so many disagreements between what is trust?
Our work is mostly based on the Xiang et al. And Meyer et al. Work.
Okay.
The thing is, as this is recent, the kind of, do I trust a visualization or not? There has been no validated approach to measure it. So to measure level of trust or whatever regarding a visualization. That's why on the first study, we were kind of exploring and saying, okay, how do you trust? But what we noticed as well is this is very broad. Like, you cannot specifically say they trusted more in this or on that characteristic. That's why on the second study, we tackle specific dimensions. And we do not, in the Likert scales, we actually never use the word trust. We just ask them to assess, does this visualization provide enough quantity of data or enough quality of data to respond to blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. Because
I was making a confusion.
There is no consensus.
Yeah, I was making a confusion there. I'm glad you clarified this, because pretty much your scope starts within in trust within a visualization apparatus, while I was already thinking about trust as this meta definition that is across different disciplines. Okay, understood now. Thank you.
We take concepts from that and we try to apply it to research, but since we're mostly exploring right now, we have to just try the different things and see what that gets us.
Cool.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah. I think, Tomás, we will probably contact you later, probably for a little bit of collaboration, because again, in XAMI, user communication is going to be vital for us. Generating human-centered explanations, human understandable explanations will be vital for us. And we will need a lot of help from people from
I'll be happy
HCI,
to.
and we'll probably keep in touch later in our research. So I would like to ask the audience if there's any more questions for Tomás. Otherwise, we can all give a big clap to Tomás to thank him for his great talk and for this Steve Jobs approved presentation.
Thank you.